So welcome everybody to Conversations About Carbon. So monthly webinar series hosted by Iowa State University's Bioeconomy Institute, as well as the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Lisa Schulte-Moore. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Natural Resource Ecology and Management at ISU and Associate Director of the Bioeconomy Institute and Director of a Sea Change Initiative, which our distinguished guest here today is also a part of. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. So the goal with Conversations About Carbon is to bring people together for an informal discussion around concepts on carbon reduction, removal, and repair in the role that agriculture can play in a changing climate. Opportunities and challenges in carbon removal are unknown to a lot of people, and so this is supposed to be educational, and we definitely want audience engagement. So as I'll spend a little bit of time getting Tom warmed up, asking some questions, but then very much welcome your questions in the chat, and I will moderate those to Tom. Overall, our session will be 45 minutes, so I'll give you a little bit of time between this session and your next Zoom or class or wherever you need to be. It's about 15, 20 minutes questions I'll ask, and then we'll open it up to the audience questions. So now I get to introduce my distinguished colleague, Dr. Tom Richard. He's a professor of agricultural and biosystems engineering and director of the Institutes for Energy and the Environment at Penn State University. He is also the Penn State lead on the Sea Change grass to gas project that we help co-administer together. For those of you that are from Iowa and have been around Iowa Ag and Engineering and Iowa State for a while, Tom will be a familiar face to you. He was a faculty member in our Agricultural and Biosystems Engineering department when I first arrived at ISU, and we got to overlap by 1 year only. But it was a great year and we've kept in contact over time. And so now it's just a real pleasure to be able to pick his brain in so many ways, and now publicly with you all in this conversation about carbon. Our theme for the conversation is renewable natural gas as a carbon solution, separating wheat from chaff, and facts from myth. And so with that, we'll get started. So Tom, my first question for you is renewable natural gas. Of course, it's a vibrant and burgeoning industry, but is probably not all that familiar to a lot of people. So give us a quick 101. What is renewable natural gas? How does it differ from fossil natural gas? And why is there so much discussion about RNG, renewable natural gas, as a renewable fuel right now?
Thanks, Lisa. And it's a real pleasure to be here or there or wherever we are on the internet these days. Yeah, so, well, I mean, I guess the really interesting thing is that we've got two grids in America. And we've been working for 20 years to put renewables into the electric grid. And there's been a lot of talk about that with solar and wind. Many people are buying renewable electricity. Some states like Pennsylvania have special programs where you can, as a consumer, you can buy all renewables and pick your supplier. But we haven't really thought about the other grid, the gas grid, and in terms of its potential for renewables until just a few years ago. And what happened in 2014 were a couple of things. The main one was the US EPA was petitioned by the landfills to add renewable natural gas to the renewable fuel standard for biofuels. And the rationale there was that not all vehicles use liquid fuels, that there are a lot of natural gas vehicles running around the country, and that the legislation was originally written to allow renewable fuels that were used for transportation. It didn't specify they had to be liquid fuels. So the EPA came out with a ruling then that allowed renewable natural gas to be eligible for all of those credits. And California, which has its low carbon fuel standard, followed suit right away. And there's a lot more money available in California. And in California, they actually allow credits for offsetting other kinds of emissions that are part of the transportation fuel production practice. And in the case of renewable natural gas, there are some big offsets, as I think we'll get to a little bit later. And the combination of those two factors just created a profit motive. And suddenly, renewable natural gas became the cellulosic biofuel. It was actually defined that way. We may want to get into that with some of the questions, but basically all farm waste and landfill waste are defined as cellulosic, and that then earns the highest renewable fuel credit through the EPA system, and in the California system earns a lot of money as well.
Thank you for that explanation. Now let's shift to the title of our conversation, or your talk, we want to look at it. So briefly, can you just share with us 3 facts about RNG, and also what's a major myth?
Yeah, well, I'll start out by just saying that I actually think that natural gas is the one that got misnamed because the original gas that people burned was actually biogas. It goes back hundreds and probably thousands of years. And then the second kind of gas, and the first pipeline infrastructure gas that we created in the United States and Europe and other industrial countries, was actually syngas. And so gasification, which has come back now, and there's a lot of great work going on at Iowa State and elsewhere in gasification to produce syngas. That syngas was synthetic gas that then could be put into a pipeline, and was what a lot of the urban gas infrastructure was originally developed for. And really only after that was already in operation, those two kinds of other gas, did natural gas from fossil fuels come onto market in a big way. And I think really the contrast there was that syngas was manufactured, usually by gasification of biomass or coal. And then this stuff that came out of the ground got to be called natural gas because it didn't have to be manufactured. But now we've got renewable natural gas. The second thing I wanted people to know about is that compared to fossil natural gas, renewable natural gas is pretty much identical. Fossil natural gas is at least 95% methane, and renewable natural gas is pretty close to pure methane. The natural gas coming out of the ground does contain some other hydrocarbons, and some of them are volatile also, like propane in low concentrations, and perhaps ethane, and some others that can be liquefied. And so there's some cleanup sometimes used in natural gas wells to take care of those. But the pipeline quality of renewable natural gas is really identical or better than fossil natural gas. And the main molecule is exactly the same molecule. It's not like different chemistry. It's CH4, one carbon and 4 hydrogens. And it does all the things we're used to natural gas doing. It burns clean in turbines. It's flexible. It can be used for heating. It can be used for stoves and dryers, and as well as for transportation. And all of the infrastructure that we have for fossil natural gas is available for renewable natural gas. Mm-hmm. The other thing that's really cool about it is when it comes out of a landfill or a biogas anaerobic digester, it's a mixture of about 60% methane and 40% carbon dioxide. And in order to upgrade it to pipeline quality, the methane has to be purified, and that's done by either an absorption system, absorption desorption, or a membrane system. Technology is pretty mature. There are some new things on the market, but it's certainly established and affordable. And what that does is it creates a secondary stream that's generally been considered a waste stream, that's pure carbon dioxide. And if you've been paying attention to the conversations on carbon, you know that pure carbon dioxide is a pretty valuable material if you're trying to create a negative carbon system. And just like the pure carbon dioxide coming off of an ethanol refinery, for which billions of dollars are being spent to create pipelines and move it to areas where it can be sequestered geologically, renewable natural gas also, by that separation process, produces a pure carbon dioxide stream that can be collected and injected into geologic systems and more or less double the carbon benefits of that particular renewable energy resource. So the myth, well, the big myth is there are two I'd like to talk about, and one we can maybe get into a little bit later. But one is that unlike the solar and wind, it isn't probably ever exactly carbon neutral. It's usually, if done well, climate positive or carbon negative, depending on how you want to run the math, but it actually can benefit the planet substantially. But that requires doing it right. And part of that is making sure none of it leaks, because if it leaks, that methane is a very strong global warming potential gas, 36 times on the mass basis, the global warming effect of carbon dioxide. And so it really has to be tightly managed without leaks in order to realize those carbon negative benefits. Mm-hmm. And the negative part is generally right now through offsets of some kind of methane emissions that would have come from the waste materials that were being digested now or in landfills. And therefore, we're actually reducing emissions of that very potent greenhouse gas, using them to offset fossil fuel emissions, and therefore creating something that's really got some positive benefits if we do it right. But then the final myth, I think, and this one I think we have to be really conscious of, is we do use a lot of natural gas for many different things. And well, there is a lot of plant production, and there's a lot of potential to make more renewable natural gas from plants as well as from waste materials. It is not going to fully replace the amount of fossil natural gas that we have in this country. Our best estimates are that it might bring in somewhere around 15%, maybe 20% of the volumes of natural gas that we're using right now. And that's not a small segment, especially if we do it nice and we make a big carbon negative footprint with it. But if we're building new natural gas infrastructure and increasing our volumes and our demand for natural gas, we will not be able to fully substitute renewable natural gas for that material, at least not from biomass. There may be other options from hydrogen or other gases that we can blend in, but renewable natural gas as we make it now is not going to fully substitute.
Awesome. That was great. And you kind of touched on a few of the questions that I was hoping to tee up, and that's great. I just want to reiterate one thing. So you said, solar, wind, great, they can be carbon neutral. An opportunity that we have with RNG, renewable natural gas, is to be carbon negative. And as a part of that is what we're doing with grass to gas, right? Where we're looking at placing green plants in sensitive areas of the agricultural environment, hopefully reduce some nitrous oxide emissions that way, another potent greenhouse gas, be able to harvest that material and then bring it in to a digester to convert it to new renewable natural gas. Talk about that vision, why it is an important part of the renewable natural gas discussion, and then, really hone in on that leakage component that you just mentioned.
Yes, great, Lisa. So the first part is the reason we're really interested in grass is for a couple of reasons. One is we actually need to grow more grass, perennial grasses and winter grasses on the landscape in order to achieve a whole range of sustainability goals. And you and your colleagues at Iowa State with the STRIPS project and other research have shown how significant that benefit can be in terms of water quality, which is a challenge in all agricultural regions of the world, in terms of biodiversity, in terms of soil carbon accumulation. There are just multiple benefits from getting more cover on the landscape. And that cover needs a market. If we're going to convert annual cropland to something else, farmers are going to want to still make some money. And so putting it into conservation plantings, which we've had subsidy programs for many decades to do, is a good idea, but that's taking taxpayer money and putting it into a particular non-use or conservation purpose. And I think there are a lot of farmers that would like to actually have a market and a product that they use their land for. And so this is an opportunity to actually take many of those still same plantings, diverse prairie mixtures, biodiverse and species of both plants and fauna, and turn it into something that actually has real value. So yeah, so then the other piece is, you remember that 15 to 20% displacement of fossil natural gas I mentioned? Mm-hmm. Well, if we don't get beyond waste materials, we're not going to get close. The amount of well, I'll give you one example. Many years ago when I was at Iowa State, we estimated how much electricity we could generate from all the livestock manure in Iowa, and relative to demand from all the people in Iowa, and those numbers are not that different. There's a lot of livestock in Iowa and not that many people. We could only supply 3% of the electricity demand with the electricity that we could generate from on-farm manure digesters. Mm-hmm. So it's a little bit maybe different now, because that was data from a while ago, but and if you add in the food waste and the landfills and the sewage sludge, those numbers might creep up to 5%, but it's still not 15 or 20%. So the grass is a huge opportunity. Here in Pennsylvania, we've done estimates, and roughly 2/3 the potential that we see in our state is from perennial grasses, winter crops, and crop residues.
Mm-hmm. Great. So I just want to point out one thing. So perennial grasses for conservation purpose, as an ecologist, I wouldn't call that a non-use, right? I would call it.
Yeah, I was stumbling on that one, Lisa. I knew you'd call me on that.
I call it a different use, but yeah, you're absolutely right. You know, farmers need to make money from their land assets. They're business people. So let's talk a little bit about the leakage and why that is even more of a concern when we're talking about grass to gas.
Well, that is absolutely more of a concern. So I mentioned how when you're using some of these waste materials that might be anaerobic and turning into methane gas and emitting that right now, the change of capturing that material and running a digester and turning into renewable natural gas is a positive change for the planet. But when we take grasses, and which right now, if they're not harvested, they're lying on the ground at the end of the winter or other times of the year as well. And they're decomposing in an environment that, well, if they're decomposing, there's microbes and there's moisture and there's also air. And they're decomposing almost entirely aerobically. And when organic matter decomposes aerobically, it doesn't produce methane, it produces carbon dioxide. Again, that factor of 36 to 1 in terms of global warming potential is really big. And if we take CO2 that would be naturally being produced by decomposition, and we make a renewable natural gas system with that same feedstock, and we have it a leaky system, then suddenly our, quote, renewable natural gas is not good for the planet in terms of its climate mitigation, because we're turning what would have been CO2 into methane and getting that nasty multiplier.
Great. So what are some of the ways to guard against that? What are, some of the technical solutions and also the R&D that's happening in this area?
Yeah, well, there's a number of different things that can be done. So first of all, the production system needs to be well managed and tight. And, that's almost a plumbing problem. I mean, you need to, like in your house, you wouldn't want to have your house leaking water. We know how to plumb tight joints. Mm-hmm. But with gases, that same level of attention hasn't always been paid. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of joints in a farm digester. There's not just the pipes that are taking the gas off, but there's the pipe systems that are taking the manure or waste materials in. There's the big tarps that capture the gas. So all those things have to be tight. There are some great tools to monitor that, infrared cameras, other methods to make sure it's not leaky and then to fix the leaks. But that's step one. The second is the distribution system. And our natural gas distribution in this country is quite variable. Some of it's pretty new and pretty well constructed and pretty tight. And some of it's old, going back to those 1800s syngas plants I was talking about that most cities had. And there can be a lot of leaks in those old systems. 2, 3, 5% of the gas going into that system might be leaking out. And so that then raises a question: should we really be putting a renewable energy into that system, especially if it's made from grass that would have been CO2? And then finally, I think we need to think about the end use of that renewable natural gas. And I mentioned that the incentives right now are almost entirely for transportation. And there is definitely some benefit there, especially when we're starting with these waste sources that are putting out methane right now. But those benefits are going to be a lot less for transportation when we start with grass. We don't get the big offsets. We have to be really careful about the leakage. And we don't get the opportunity to have as clean a burn at the end use in an automobile as we can in, for example, a gas turbine, or even a combustion system for a hot water boiler and a water heater or a stove. Mm-hmm. It turns out internal combustion engines just really are not that good at burning any hydrocarbons. We figured that out half a century ago. We passed a Clean Air Act that would put catalytic converters on all cars to burn off the 2 or 3% of the hydrocarbons that run through the engine and aren't burned. But we, at the time, weren't very worried about methane. And that law, the Air Pollution Control Act, the Clean Air Act, did not, actually it specifically excluded methane from those hydrocarbon emissions. Mm-hmm. So now we should be rethinking that, I think. And part of that means we need to be generating better combustion systems in vehicles, or moving that renewable natural gas to places where we can really get clean combustion.
Awesome, great. Well, I'm going to open it up to our audience for questions. I encourage you to put them in the chat. And we have one already from Brian Sievers, a farmer friend and colleague out in Eastern Iowa. So Brian asks, have there been any calculations or has there been research conducted to determine how much carbon negative renewable natural gas is necessary to become carbon neutral in the United States? So whatever the source, whether it be manure, industrial, organic, or food waste, biomass from cover crops.
That's a great question. So actually, a lot depends on what the rest of the energy infrastructure looks like in the United States. So becoming carbon neutral actually is a question of how much you have to offset. And I'll give you an example. Dan Sanchez and colleagues at Berkeley about 6 years ago now did a really nice analysis of the Western power region for electricity. And these numbers will be different for renewable natural gas in other parts of the country and because it's a gas. But anyway, they looked at using biomass energy for electricity instead. And they could offset a large amount of the residual fossil fuel emissions from a highly renewable electric grid, okay? And they could do that cheaper than any other source. They could do that with a large negative emissions. In fact, they showed that with biomass carbon capture and storage, capturing the CO2 from that biomass, they could get an electric system on the West Coast that would produce emissions that were 146% less than the current emissions. So not just 100% less, which was carbon neutral, but 146% less. And that was from only 14% of the electricity being from biomass.
Wow.
So I just said we could get 15% of our natural gas from biomass. So I think the math is probably pretty close. Yes, we could offset it if the rest of our system was largely renewable, but probably not if it's almost all fossil. That's the difference.
Yeah. Good clarification. All right, another question from Yu Wang, who's a faculty in political science here at Iowa State. So with the leakage problem, do you think RNG should be considered a cellulosic biofuel by the EPA?
Well, I'm a scientist and engineer, and I always get uncomfortable when politicians make definitions for what things are what. Okay, so that's, and I don't know. I mean, the EPA is full of scientists too, and it was an EPA definition, but I think there was some influence. Cellulose is actually a particular kind of thing, right? And it's a molecule. It grows in plants. It's part of the plant cell wall and its structure. It turns out that saying everything on a farm is automatically cellulosic is not correct. There's lots of sugar, starch, there's lipids on a farm. Most of our livestock on farms are fed a lot of grains that are starch. Those things in liquid fuels like ethanol don't count as cellulosic. So it's not obvious to me why they count as cellulosic for renewable natural gas. But I do think in the case of ethanol, the potential for leakage and some really problematic effects are much lower because it's not producing methane. It's not producing something with that high global warming potential. So I guess, regardless of the definition, I do think we need to have really tight systems. And one of the nice things is that the California low carbon fuel standard actually requires every single facility or type of operation to calculate a carbon intensity score. And that's third-party verified. And there they are looking at that full system. And if grass to gas can get a good rating in that California system, then it will show us that in fact it is a good thing. Mm-hmm. If it can't, then we're going to learn a different lesson.
Mm-hmm. Great depth here and great questions. Here's one from John Crespi, who's our director of the Center for Agriculture and Rural Development here at Iowa State. So your last point on the Clean Air Act is an important one. In fact, environmental regulations exempt a lot of the oil and gas industry, things like you mentioned, the methane, the catalytic converters. I don't see a lot of talk about loosening regulations to allow more non-oil power. Do you? Just curious if you're hearing talk of regulations changes that are being needed.
Yeah, I spent the morning with an oil and gas company. So, one of the things that I think is, actually, I think they were repositioning themselves quite clearly into being an energy company. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that the companies I've talked to pretty much uniformly say is they're pretty much ready for the energy transition. They've had several decades to figure out pathways. What they're waiting for is some clear and consistent and reliable signal. And it's got to be a price signal or a regulatory signal. They're ready to adapt either way. They know they'll be able to make money. And meanwhile, they're actually feeling like they're wasting a lot of money because they don't know what the future is. And so they're kind of having to keep their finger in a whole bunch of things that aren't really working very much. So I think really an acceleration is what's needed. And part of that does need to be regulation on emissions. And I think a level playing field that actually looks at the methane emissions from biogas facilities and livestock facilities and oil and gas wells and really figures out pathways to mm-hmm. minimize those methane emissions. That's really, really important. And I'm not a policy wonk, but I think there are some pathways there that can be structured in a way which will provide incentives for farms and others that maybe don't have the financial resources of big oil and gas companies mm-hmm. to make those transitions, to take care of the methane emissions from their livestock manure, to make natural gas systems work well. And I think we need to get on with that. Great.
So here's a question from a PhD student on the Grass to Gas project. I encouraged them to, this was their turn to turn the tables, and the professor had to defend, right? So digestate leaving, the digester will still be emitting biogas into the atmosphere for a short while. Do these methane CO2 emissions play a larger role in the LCA life cycle analysis of anaerobic digestion, or are they often ignored? And then also gets me to one of the questions I was asking you about, AD, anaerobic digestion versus composting. Help us understand the difference.
Okay. Well, let me take the first question first and then get to the comparison. So yeah, that methane, that manure that's not fully digested in a controlled, engineered, oftentimes mixed digester, taking it out of that tank does not turn it into an aerobic process. It turns out that oxygen diffuses really slowly in liquids. That's why we have a hard time breathing underwater. We don't have gills. But it also means that even if you don't have a cover on a manure storage, oxygen penetration, you could measure the depth in millimeters. It's not going to penetrate the material. And so it is largely anaerobic, and it will keep digesting, and it will keep producing methane and CO2, and that will be emitted. Usually, I think most of our farm digesters in the US have a fairly long retention time, 30, 40, 50 days. But if you're going to be applying your manure once or twice a year, then you've got to have some storage tanks. And if those storage tanks aren't covered, you might have gotten 80, 90% of the decomposition that's going to happen in your contained system, and you might be losing another 10 or 20%. And yes, that does matter. It is in the LCA studies, life cycle assessments that I read or that I recite, because I want to make sure they're careful. And plenty of the people that do that work are being very careful. But just to give you a sense of the implication, in Denmark, and Lisa and I, we were on a conversation with some folks there. They're now extending their digester residence time, sometimes in a secondary digester, to 80, 90, 100 days in order to capture that residual methane, and both use it as a renewable energy source, but also prevent it from being lost. Okay, so you want to talk about composting? Well, first of all, before I started working with anaerobic digestion, I spent most of my career working with composting. And I have a lot of friends in the composting industry. I've got a lot of publications in that area. I understand it pretty well. I honestly don't know what the best thing to do with grass is. I think if we make compost with it in a good composting system, we can keep it pretty aerobic and have very few methane emissions. But a lot of the composting facilities I see are not always managed that well. If it's got a lot of wet waste, it oftentimes isn't fully aerobic. There might be an area of some part of the volume that's actually producing methane. However, composting systems do have a little bit of an advantage, because methane is actually readily decomposed in an aerobic environment when microbes can grab a hold of it. And so as that methane sort of works its way out of a pile, it moves from an anaerobic compost zone in the maybe bottom middle of the pile where it's too wet up into an aerobic zone. And there it can break down to CO2. So most of the work on life cycle analysis of compost indicates that methane's not being generated in very large amounts. There may be some nitrous oxide, that's another greenhouse gas. There's likely to be a lot of ammonia, especially if there's nitrogen-rich wastes that are in there. But in general, it can be a pretty reasonable system. But it is producing a lot of CO2, and we're not capturing any energy out of that material. So we're not able to substitute for any of our fossil emissions. It's just kind of parked over there as probably a pretty good thing, but not really addressing the energy challenge. Renewable natural gas clearly can.
Awesome. Great. Thank you. So a question about cost of RNG from a manure digester. It's higher than natural gas, right? Fossil natural gas. So what are some of the ways that people are researching development to reduce the cost of RNG production and make it competitive with, right now relying on incentives, but are there ways that it can be cost competitive without those incentives?
Yeah, great question. And that's a big focus of our work in Sea Change. And there's a couple of different strategies, actually 12. I won't go through them all right now that we're working on. But one of them is to get more methane production. And one of the best ways to do that appears to be by recycling CO2 into the digester, and also by recycling or using inputs of biochar into the digester. And both of those processes accelerate the methane production and allow us to get more renewable energy from the same amount of manure. Now, the numbers aren't huge, but more methane is more income. The question is, can we do that for less cost? And anytime you add things, there's obviously an additional cost associated with that. So that's one of the things we're looking at. Another is a lot of the energy input into those digesters is from heating the manure or the liquids. And so if we put in heat exchangers and take the effluent and capture the heat from the effluent and use that in the influent, that looks like a pretty cost-effective strategy. But again, there's, it saves a lot of energy, but can we do it without the infrastructure? I think that the two things that I think are probably most radical that we're exploring through modeling right now, but I think are very hopeful, are really about changing the system configuration. So right now we typically have a farm digester that has a digester producing biogas, and at the same site, we have the system for converting that biogas into something of value. Might be an engine generator to produce electricity, might be a separator to produce renewable natural gas. The digester, there's some economies of scale for, but it's that second piece of equipment that has some serious economies of scale, both the separation or the electricity generator. And if we don't need to have those on every farm, then we start to have some interesting and different economics. And I think looking at aggregation of farms, looking at mobile units for gas separation that can fit onto a truck, taking some of the capital interest cost out of it, and also the complexity out of the system is I think going to be the way we actually get the biggest cost savings.
Cool. So there's another question here that relates. What infrastructure is needed to implement RNG more broadly?
Well, so we do need that sort of system to get the gas from lots of farms into injection points. And it's not surprising that there is economy of scale in everything that we do in industry. And in that particular case, there's big economies of scale in the separation, but even bigger in the injection. If you want to tap into a natural gas pipeline, you've got to have a pressurization system, you've got to have monitoring, you've got to have flow measurements. There's just a lot involved. And so I think what we need really are third-party developers that can put together projects where we have lots of farms involved in a coordinated fashion, and we're helping to solve multiple problems at the same time with common infrastructure.
Great. Another question from one of the PhD students for us at Penn State. So in an ideal carbon neutral or carbon negative energy future, what end uses, residential, industry, transportation, et cetera, would be appropriate for RNG as opposed to electricity from renewables like solar and wind? Like, do these things go together? Are they competing, or should they compete, or shouldn't they compete? That kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think in my mind, there's a couple of pretty valuable answers. And again, recognizing that renewable natural gas is not going to be enough to solve all of our energy needs, but where can it be used strategically? So I think part of that is you have to think about what are the hard things to solve with a highly renewable energy system. And one of them is energy storage. So we know that the grid demand fluctuates. There's, on hot summer afternoons and cold winter nights, there's a lot more demand for energy. Well, it turns out that natural gas, renewable or otherwise, is really easy to store and to dispatch on a very short time frame. And so we can use that renewable natural gas to kick on electricity generators, to power air conditioners in the winter or heaters in the summer, and do that much cheaper than building huge battery backup systems and the extra capacity of solar and wind to charge those things up all the time. So there's some real cost savings there. And I think that idea of strategically complementing intentionally the intermittency of solar and wind with the dispatchability, if I can use that word, of renewable natural gas, that looks like really good synergy to me. So the other thing that I mentioned earlier is I think we should look at point uses where we can get the kinds of scale that we can capture the CO2. And that's not going to happen at my gas stove or your hot water heater. That's going to be at a power plant that might be serving a region that will be able to feed in electricity to the grid to complement solar or wind when the night's down or the wind's not blowing, and do that many, many days of the year at a scale where it makes sense to collect the CO2 from that gas turbine. And then we double the carbon benefit of that renewable natural gas.
Fantastic. We're starting to run out of time, so just a few quick questions. There's a lot more that I'm here that I'm not going to get answers or get to, but this has just been a fantastic conversation. Lots of really great questions and great information, so thank you. So digestate as a biofertilizer and the potential to reduce reliance on mineral fertilizer, for example. or fossil-based nitrogen fertilizer. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, and I wish we had another half an hour, but I'll try to be really quick. So first of all, from a nitrogen standpoint, in the fertilizer value of nitrogen, renewable natural gas digestate from an anaerobic digester is really much better than the manure that went into the digester. Primarily because the organic nitrogen has been converted largely to ammonia nitrogen, and ammonia nitrogen is available to plants. It's predictable. A lot of the fertilizer that farmers are used to using is ammonia based. And so it actually fits into a predictable agricultural crop production system in ways where raw manure is just a little bit too unpredictable, and farmers don't trust it and they don't think they're going to get enough nitrogen out of it. So they end up applying the manure and their nitrogen fertilizer, and they overload their system. So I think if we can use that benefit of having more predictable nitrogen in the digestate to actually help farmers not over apply, but use more precision nutrient management techniques, we can solve a lot of nutrient management problems in agriculture. The second piece is the carbon. And I think the carbon is really interesting. We don't know enough about it. Lisa, you and I were on a panel in Europe about a year ago, and this was the topic of the panel. And I was really struck by, gee, here's all the European researchers that are doing a lot with anaerobic digestion, but they don't know the answer either. So I think we're starting some studies now in the laboratory, and we want to try to figure out how to do some in the field. But it does look like digestate should have some advantages over manure in terms of long-term carbon storage, because we're taking out a lot of the soluble carbohydrates. But we don't know how it behaves over the long term yet.
Great. All right, I think two more for a quick. So just curious, if there's any environmental or wildlife impacts that we should be thinking about with renewable natural gas?
Well, I think there are on the collection of the feedstock side. So the grass to gas concept is that we're going to use these conservation ecosystems that are producing all kinds of ecosystem services that have great value to our society, even if we refuse to pay for them. And we know that to manage those landscapes, there are times when it's good to harvest and there are times when it's bad. So if we're interested in bird biodiversity, for example, we shouldn't be cutting that tall grass prairie when the birds are nesting. And similarly, there's lots of other biodiversity aspects to the management, I think, that are important. But I think there is compatibility potential. And in fact, that's another important part of the grass to gas team.
That's right. That's right. Maybe another conversation in the future. We can talk about that. And then last one real quick, how about capturing gas from landfills? Can that be managed with minimal leakage? Yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, well, so for about 30 years, we've been capping our landfills in most of the United States, and we've been putting these heavy plastic liners on them to keep them from emitting landfills and methane and odors. And largely because that gas was coming up, and if we didn't capture it and bleed it off of the system, those plastic liners would balloon up and cause all kinds of problems. So that landfill gas has been collected. It is largely flared, but because of the economies of scale, it is rapidly, those flares are rapidly getting turned into separators, and renewable natural gas is being produced and marketed. And so that transition is happening. It's actually very low cost. It's dominating the market right now. There's actually not that much left. A lot of those landfills have already been converted, and I think they will be converted in the next couple of years. But it's kind of been the low-hanging fruit for all the reasons that the questioner asked.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Tom. This is where we're all clapping and thanking you for your willingness to share your expertise and answer questions from the audience. That was great. Got to a lot of the kinds of questions we're getting from people about what we're doing with grass to gas. And of course, the research will be coming in the next 4 or 5 years to help even provide more depth in some of the areas where needs more research and development to be able to really provide a solid solution for society. So thank you so much again, Tom. That was great. And I just have a couple slides I'd like to share in terms of wrapping up. And Yes, there we go. So if you are enjoying these conversations about carbon and there's someone else that you would like to hear from, by all means, we encourage you to submit your ideas. We're here for you. We want to be attentive to the kinds of questions and concerns or just curiosity that our audience has. So please, by all means, either submit them to this the Smartsheet form or just email myself, and we'll try to see what we can do in terms of lining up a conversation about carbon. Our next conversation is going to be on Tuesday, December 10th or 7th, sorry, at 10 a.m. So Ranga Apuhami from our own Iowa State University Department of Animal Science will be talking with us, and he has expertise in the animal agricultural side. And so the title is Feeding Cows to Mitigate Methane Emissions, more on methane, sustainably. And then we'll take a little bit of a break, of course, for the holidays. And on Wednesday, January 19th, we had some questions about LCA today. We'll get in those very deeply in January. So excited to have also Michael Wang, who's a senior scientist and director of the Systems Assessment Center of Energy Systems at Argonne National Lab, with us on that Wednesday, January 19th. So thanks again, everybody. And again, thank you, Dr. Tom Richard. That was great. And see you soon on Zoom.
Thank you all. Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks, Tom.